Hello and welcome to the third episode of Roman Catholic Pride. Thank you for joining me in this episode, and I hope you've listened to the first two episodes, especially episode 1. If you haven't listened to that, please go back and check that out because that gives you a little better description of what this podcast is and what I am attempting to do with it. And how I thought I'd start these series of podcasts is to look at the question of the papacy in its current state, and the legitimacy or illegitimacy of the papacy. There's many opinions on whether the current pope is a legitimate pope, and actually there's plenty of questions about whether the series of popes since Vatican II have been legitimate popes or whether they have lost their legitimacy. So I want to kind of look at this question to start my podcast and kind of dig into this issue a little bit. And so what I thought I'd start with is the SSPX position on the question of a heretical pope and if that means that they've lost their legitimacy or not. And I'm starting with the SSPX position because I think that's kind of the mainstream position of most traditionalists, I would say. Though it's not the only position, because we will look at Sedevacantists and what their take is on this. And I would also say, too, that I don't know that it's necessarily the right position. I don't think anybody really has come out with a position on this that everybody agrees is the definitive position on this. And I think that we need to keep in mind that I don't know that we'll ever come to a good answer to this until our Lord comes again, or unless he gives us an absolute and for sure sign on this issue. So I think we have to have Christian charity in how we approach this subject. We have to be kind and patient with each other in this, and realize that nobody has, except Jesus Christ, their hand on the absolute truth here. So, please, would really appreciate your comments on this subject. I know there's a lot of opinions on it, and I'm trying to stay away from opinions on it and just give some learned scholarship on it, because I think there is a lot of good information out there. So this series of articles that I'm going to read from is actually from 2017. And this really came about after Amoris Laetitia was released in 2016, and then you had the dubia that was released by the four cardinals: Burke, Brandmuller, Caffarra, and Meisner. And there was also the kind of a lay and priestly response that basically said that Pope Francis was an open heretic as a result of all this. So this goes back to that. So these articles were written by Father Jean-Michel Gleize, who at the time at least was a professor in the SSPX's seminary in Ancon, Switzerland. And he wrote a series of 6 articles titled The Question of Papal Heresy. And so what I'd like to do today is read parts 1 and part 2 of this. Part 1 is very short, just kind of sets the ground for it, and then we'll get into part 2. And then depending on the length of the next 4 parts, I'd like to do it 2 per episode, but we'll see, because I'd really like to keep the episodes to a half an hour. So please, as always, if you find value in this, please like and share, and this will be available on multiple different formats. So if I get banned from one of the mainstream formats, then you'll have to find me on another format, such as Gab, which will be probably my main format outside of YouTube. So you can either find me on Gab TV or YouTube, as well as in podcast format on Anchor FM and Stitcher. So without any further delay, let's get into this. So the question of papal heresy, part 1. Heretical pope Loss of papal office. Are St. Bellarmine's comments only opinions? Father Gleize reviews the matter in a series of 6 articles. As I said, Father Jean-Michel Gleize has been a professor in the SSPX's seminary of St. Pius X in Écon, Switzerland for 20 years, where he is currently teaching ecclesiology. He is the author of numerous articles in Courrier de Rome, and at this time of this article, he was a consultant also to the SSPX Commission responsible for doctrinal discussions with the Holy See. So Part 1, Introduction to the Problem. In autumn of 2014, then again in October 2015, Pope Francis convened 2 synods in Rome to consult with bishops from all over the world on questions concerning the human family. The outcome was, on March 19, 2016, the post-synodal apostolic exhortation Amoris Laetitia on, quote, love in the family, unquote. Its 8th chapter opens the door to a practical denial of the Church's traditional discipline concerning the sacrament of marriage, and consequently calls into question also the dogmatic presupposition underlining it. On September 15, 2016, the 4 cardinals Burke, Brandmüller, Caffarra, and Meissner sent to the Supreme Pontiff a private letter in which they respectfully asked him to clarify the recent apostolic exhortation on 5 disputed points, using the traditional procedure of dubia, or doubts. In other words, by formulating 5 questions calling for a clear yes or no answer. The explicit intention of this step was to verify whether the text of the exhortation at the points indicated could be considered in conformity with the moral teaching of the Church to date. Since Pope Francis gave no response, the 5 dubia were made public on November 16th. To date, the Holy See still had not provided the expected response. Giving an account of this silence during an interview published on LifeSite News on December 19th, Cardinal Burke declared that there must be a response to the dubia, quote, because they have to do with the very foundations of the moral life and of the Church's constant teaching with regard to good and evil, with regard to various sacral realities like marriage and Holy Communion and so forth, unquote. For his part, when questioned by Andrea Tornielli in the Italian newspaper La Stampa, Cardinal Brandmüller declared on December 27th, quote, we cardinals are waiting for the answers to the dubia, inasmuch as a lack of response could be seen by broad sectors of the Church as a refusal to adhere clearly and distinctly to defined doctrine, unquote. Many reflections are coming to light in the wake of the Cardinal Lachiel initiative. Just how far will this fraternal correction go? Above all, what would be the consequences thereof in the event that Francis refused to take them into account? For John Lamont, the Pope's response is still awaited, but one can from now on assert that Francis is teaching heresy. This is why, in the event that the correction proved ineffective, the theological opinion inherited from St. Robert Bellarmine, envisaging the dethronement of a pope who had fallen into heresy, could very well be the solution. All the more so because in an interview granted to Catholic World Report on December 19, 2016, Cardinal Burke, while careful not to say that Francis is a heretic, presents this hypothesis of Bellarmine as a solid conclusion and does not rule out the possibility that the College of Cardinals might be led to draw this conclusion in view of the facts. The question about a heretical pope, which is discussed relatively little in the scholastic manuals of theology, nevertheless attracted the attention of some major authors. In any case, it provides material for debate, which to this day has never really been taken to its ultimate conclusions. The important thing is to go back to the principles that always remain the same, through all contingencies, even if the application thereof might momentarily cause difficulties. In the remaining articles in this series, we will distinguish 3 main questions. 1. Is it possible for a pope to fall into heresy? 2. Can the presently reigning Supreme Pontiff, Pope Francis, be considered heretical precisely because of what he teaches in Chapter 8 of the exhortation Amoris Laetitia? 3. Does a pope who has fallen into heresy lose the pontificate? And that's the end of part 1 regarding the question of papal heresy. So he just lays out there for us what's behind this and why he's decided to take this subject on. But I would just propose, too, that this isn't limited just to this question of Francis or Bergoglio and his legitimacy. I think this really strikes at the heart of the papacy since Vatican II, because every one of these popes to some degree has either or has proposed some heresy or has remained silent. In other words, condoning heretical actions within the church, or they have practiced an act of heresy. Think, for example, John Paul II at Assisi kissing the Quran and saying that that it's a very good and holy book. Well, that's heresy. It's not a good and holy book. So this question is bigger than Amoris Laetitia and Pope Francis. And so let's see what he has to say in the second part of this series of articles. So part 2, the question of papal heresy. The case of Pope John the 22nd. Legends live on persistently. The legend about the heresy of Pope John the 22nd is one of the hardier ones. As with other episodes, a partial story has replaced the true one in this case. We do not deny, however, that the lessons of history can be of great help. In fact, very often, in order to understand, it is necessary to compare. And in order to compare, it is necessary to have points of comparison available. Indeed, it is not enough to possess principles. It is necessary also to measure the extent of their significance by verifying how the light that they shed for us explains concrete experience, and how, too, the concrete reality calls for that light and validates its illumination. The metaphysical level of abstraction on which our reflections are defined, Etienne Gilson writes somewhere, quote, allows for great simplicity and facilitates brevity, but we must acknowledge that it does not allow first philosophy to fulfill its function completely. In order to present our abstract conclusions in their intelligible efficacy, it will be useful to show them at work in a particular case, thus giving an example of the sorts of disassociations from ideas to which metaphysics subjects reality, but also of the way in which it sheds light on it by those same analyses. Unquote. It is the same with theological reflection, which utilizes philosophy as its tool of preference, and which also is the reflection of a sort of wisdom. This later kind of reflection needs to be projected onto facts in order to be able to validate in them its own light. At the same time, it sheds light on them, and these facts are provided by history. This indicates the extent to which a misunderstanding of history could prove fatal, or at least the source of imbalances. It has been, and it can be again. Quote, read from start to finish the works of the most illustrious scholastic writers, and they will never make you feel the sense of the individual. They will never let you perceive the relative, changing aspects of things. They deal with the true without age or date. Most often the truth that they consider does not in itself have any relation to praxis, and even when it belongs to a practical science, the manner of proposing and discussing it depends on pure speculation. It is indisputable that the habit of abstract thought makes them lose their taste for facts, and consequently for historical studies. The incompetence of the Middle Ages in this respect cannot be called into question. We even have difficulty getting any idea of it in an historical, literary age like ours. Quote, the reader was hardly demanding with regard to the historian. He did not ask him to cite his sources or to discuss them for him. He readily took him at his word, and if the account seemed plausible, edifying, or marvelous, he was quite disposed to regard it as true. The art of discovering, selecting, and interpreting documents that contained the truth was unknown. One can cite a few exceptions, but they prove absolutely nothing against the general state of mind that we are pointing out. We are indeed obliged to apply to the epochs in history the rule according to which one designates things depending on what predominates in them," unquote. This lacuna provides most especially detrimental when the theologian seeks precedents in support of his hypotheses. Recent current events amply illustrate this. The obvious explanation for the sudden infatuation with which the least qualified non-specialists have set out to scrutinize the acts and deeds of Pope John XXII is their intent to endorse the step taken by the four cardinals who dispute Amoris Laetitia. Thus, writers here or there mention a joint letter by the theologians of the University of Paris, which, if it really existed, would prefigure and at the same time justify the dubia of our cardinals. Some speak also about a condemnation or ever a deposition of Pope John XXII, which, assuming that they were duly established historical facts, could soon be a useful precedent. What one might call the analogy of history is a perfectly legitimate way of proceeding, but still it is necessary to make sure that it rests on adequate foundations. John XXIII's life and writings. Jacques Dues, born in Cahors, was the immediate successor of Clement V, who had taken up residence in Avignon. Jacques Dues was elected after a 27-month vacancy on August 7, 1316. Clement V had died on April 20, 1314. He was elected unanimously. The new pope was 72 years old. By training, he was a canonist. He taught in Toulouse. He was a favorite of King of Naples, Charles II of Anjou. Elected Bishop of Fréjus in 1300, he was called to Naples by the sovereign as Chancellor of the Kingdom of Sicily in early 1308. He served in his capacity until Pope Clement V transferred him to the See of Avignon on March 18, 1310. Created cardinal with the titular see of Saint Vital, in December 1312, he was promoted to Bishop of Porto in April 1313. After becoming pope with the name of John XXII, 1316 to 1334, he served Holy Church meritoriously on more than one count. First, he was the one who canonized St. Thomas Aquinas on July 18, 1323, and on that occasion he paid a fine tribute to the one who later would be proclaimed the common doctor of the Church. Quote, "Why look for miracles?" unquote, the Pope said, speaking of the angelic doctor. Quote, "He performed as many miracles as he wrote articles in the Summa Theologia. His life was holy, and his teaching could not have been anything but miraculous, for he enlightened the Church more than all other doctors, and by reading his works one derives more profit in just 1 year of study than by studying the teaching of the others throughout one's life," unquote. Secondly, he was the one who pronounced the first condemnation of the false principle of laicism, as it appears in the Defensor Pacis by Marsilius of Padua, 1343. This work dates from the year 1324, and it defends the schismatic attitude of the German Emperor Ludwig of Bavaria. Its ecclesiology would be condemned by Pope John XXII in his apostolic constitution Licet Juxta Doctrinam, October 23, 1327, along with propositions number 3, number 4, and number 5, which are anathematized as contrary to sacred scripture and inimical to the Catholic faith, heretical, or similar to heresies and erroneous. The Pope adds that, quote, "the above-mentioned Marsilius and John are heretics indeed, manifest and notorious arch-heretics," unquote. Thirdly and finally, we owe to John XXII the great reform of 1316 to 1317, which revised the territorial allocation of bishoprics in the Kingdom of France by modifying the ecclesiastical division of the two provinces of Aquitaine and First Narbonnaise. Excuse me my pronunciations. Back to the article. Giving birth on June 25, 1317, among others, to the Diocese of Manitoban, which was carved out of the Diocese of Toulouse. Did John the 22nd have some sinister history? Should we see him as the prototype of a, quote, heretical, unquote, pope, subject to the justice of his cardinals? The basic facts of the case are set forth nicely by the Dictionnaire de Théologie Catholique in the article Benoit XII. Twice in 1318 and 1326, John the 22nd had taught that the souls of the saints enjoyed the beatific vision as soon as they arrived in heaven, and before the general resurrection of all mankind. But from 1331 on, he supported the contrary opinion in his preaching. On All Saints' Day 1331, then on the third Sunday of Advent of that same year, again on the eve of Epiphany 1332, and finally on Ascension Thursday, May 5, 1334. The chief authority on which he relies is St. Bernard. The later has been influenced by St. Hilary, St. Ambrose, and St. Augustine, whose language is not always very clear. Accusations of heresy. The important point is the following one, quote, John the 22nd presented himself in his sermons not as Pope speaking as ex cathedra, but as a private teacher who is giving his opinion and acknowledges that it is debatable while seeking to prove it. In his second speech, we read these words, I say, like St. Augustine, that if I am mistaken here, let the one who knows better correct me. This is how it seems to me. Nothing else, unless someone shows me a contrary decision of the Church or an authoritative argument from sacred Scripture that would express this matter more clearly than the above-cited authorities. To see here an attitude prefiguring that of the promulgator of Amoris Laetitia would be rather bold. Spare us such hypocrisy. But as always in the fallen world, and even well before the invention of the Internet, minds began to fret about this, especially in France, where King Philip VI already lent an ear to accusations that were hastily leveled against the Pope. He convened in Vincennes on December 19, 1933, a council in which 20 doctors of the University of Paris were assembled. The King of France forwarded the result of this deliberation to the Pope, asking him to be so kind as to explain his thought more precisely. This was no order from the University of Paris, therefore, but a simple initiative by a temporal sovereign who, for this purpose, consulted his theologians. Moreover, John the 22nd had already taken the lead by asking for theological research to be done on the debated point, convening for this purpose a consistory of cardinals on December 28, 1333, and above all, on December 3, 1334, he made in the presence of these cardinals an explicit, solemn retraction, the terms of which are reprinted by the Dictionnaire de Théologie Catholique. Quote, This is how we declare the opinion that we presently have and have had on this matter, in union with the Holy Catholic Church. We confess and believe that the souls separated from their bodies and completely purified are in heaven, and in the kingdom of heaven in paradise, and with Jesus Christ in the company of the angels, and that following the common law, they see God in the divine essence face to face and clearly, as far as the state and condition of the separated soul allow. If in any way we have said something else or have expressed ourselves otherwise on this matter, we said so while remaining attached to the Catholic faith, in habitu fide Catholica. And while speaking by way of exposition and discussion, this is what we affirm, and this is the sense in which everything must be taken. Then, when he was dying, the Pope submitted to the judgment of the Church and of his successors what he had said and written on this point, or on any other. A closer examination of the matter. One of the first acts of his successor, Benedict XII, would be to publish this retraction in the form of a bull. There is no heresy in the remarks of John 22nd, quote, since at the time of the controversy the point in question had not yet been sanctioned by the Church, neither by a formal definition nor by a belief that was in fact sufficiently clear and universal, unquote. No dethronement, no condemnation. Quite the contrary. The dogmatic definition published by Benedict XII is nothing but the repetition of the very statement by John the 22nd. Well then, where does the legend come from? From those whom John the 22nd had condemned, not only partisans of the emperor's supremacy over the Pope, who were denounced as heretics in the bull Licet Juxta Doctrinam, but also the Franciscan rigorists, the spirituals or Fraticellis, who insisted on an excessive concept of evangelical poverty, so that John the 22nd had to denounce them also as heretics in the bull Quorumdam Exigit. These recalcitrant groups found their spokesman in the person of William of Ockham. He magisterially declared that the Pope had to make a pure and simple retraction, baldly in these or equivalent terms, quote, I abjure the heresy that I approved and taught in asserting that the souls of the saints do not have in heaven the clear vision of God, unquote. Embittered by his failure and condemnation, Ludwig of Bavaria supported these schismatic intrigues, even going so far as to envisage the meeting of a council that would depose Jacques de Cahors. It must be acknowledged this is a far cry from Amoris Laetitia and Cardinal Burke. One can only compare things that are comparable, and there is no possible point of comparison here. At most, one could acknowledge that there might have been in Jacques Duez a lack of temperance in his intellectual research, let us say a certain eccentricity resulting from an unbridled theological curiosity. But Pope John the 22nd had the wisdom not to present this research as a formally magisterial teaching, and above all, not to persist stubbornly in these risky views. Furthermore, wasn't this curiosity, along with the research that it led to, the sign of a sort of vitality? Every man naturally desires to know good, old Aristotle could say. And if he was forbidden to do so, the angelic doctor adds, he would be deprived of his happiness and frustrated in his natural aspirations. Must we then blame the Pope, who canonized the common doctor of the Church, for having that appetite, even if it was a bit exuberant? And there ends the second part of a question of papal heresy. So I hope that this is enlightening to you, and I hope you gain something from listening to this. I think the question of John the 22nd is a very interesting question, and I know that I had always read that he was a heretic, but from this article it would seem that he wasn't, or at least that more research needs to be done into this subject. So I hope you find this series of episodes helpful. Next week we will cover part 3 of the question of a papal heresy, and possibly part 4. We'll look into that and see. And then after we get through this series of SSPX articles, I will give a few episodes to the sedevacantist position on the question of a heretical pope and how the Pope can lose his papacy, followed by at least St. Robert Bellarmine's famous work on this. We'll look at that briefly, and I will do a little bit more research too and see if there's any other saints' writings that we need to look back to, our church writings, papal documents that may have some relevance here that we may want to take a look at. So wishing you all, as I record this, a blessed Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and wishing you a blessed week, and we will see you next Sunday. God bless. If you've enjoyed this content, please check out more on Gab TV, where Roman Catholic Pride is broadcast and published, as well as YouTube, and you can also listen to the podcast at Anchor FM and also on Stitcher. Please also check out my website, www.romancatholicpride.com, for show notes as well as other content and resources for you. God bless.